Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Charles Godfrey, and I'm director of the Oxford Martin School here at Oxford University. And it's my great pleasure to introduce our speaker this evening, or this evening in UK time, Guru Madhavan. And Guru is the Norman R. Augustine Senior Scholar and Senior Director of Programs at the National Academy of Engineering in DC in the States, and is a systems engineer who works on biomedical products and appliances. And we had hoped that Guru was going to be present with us in Oxford today, but unfortunately he was called back to the States. But we're very grateful that he's arranged to give his talk today. So what we're going to do is Guru is going to speak for a bit about his brilliant new book. Then Guru and I will have a conversation, and then we hope to have some questions from our online audience. And you should all be on Crowdcast, or those of you who are on Crowdcast, you'll be able to see to the bottom right of your screens that there is a facility for you to ask questions, and please do that. So with no further ado, Guru, over to you.
Well, thank you very much, and a special thanks to the team of the Oxford Martin School. It's an honor to discuss my new work. I want to start by saying that engineers aren't commonly thought of as enablers of democracy. Yet, we do a bit more than tech support, you see. Engineering is a carrier of history, simultaneously an instrument and the infrastructure of politics. As one of humanity's original cultural processes, engineering embodies the know-how far predating the sciences of know-what. And it's through engineering, I argue, that our civic engagement can develop a more structured, systemic, and survivable sense of purpose. Crucially, engineering is peer-reviewed by reality. So limiting engineering only to technology while excluding sociology is as misguided as claiming evolution is purely genetic, ignoring cultural factors, and reducing economics to rationality, dismissing behavioral aspects. These points frame my book that, in part, explores how engineering can enrich its policy and cultural relevance. Now, engineers, myself included, love to call ourselves problem solvers. It's central to our identity. But for wicked problems, one must go beyond mere problem solving. Effective problem formulation requires, first, an awareness of the types of problems that lead to wickedness. Let's see three types. Hard problems are bounded and boundable. Scientific principles, market pressures, and sponsor requirements neatly specify them. The outcomes are directed, even dictated, by customers, consumers, and clients. If you have used your smartphone to check into a flight or used a QR code to order tacos, then these are results from hard problems. They can be solved by remixing, repurposing existing tools and techniques with the worldview that best possible outcome exists and is achievable. Comparatively, soft problems are in the arena of human and organizational behavior. Despite their name, they're anything but soft. With the unclear endpoints and thorny constraints, soft problems cannot be solved like hard problems. They can only be resolved. Manufacturing a car is a hard problem. Managing city traffic is a soft problem, which is actually a harder problem. Adding more roads doesn't necessarily clear bottlenecks. Congestion pricing fails if people can't afford it. What works for one bridge might not work for another. And how do we even decide how our time is worth? How much our time is worth? Each intervention creates new perplexities, new problem sets. Since soft problems fuse factors much more than technology, such as financial and political psychology, the best we can achieve is only good enough. No matter how technical they appear, you simply cannot address soft problems without affecting people and policies at large. And this brings up the essential cultural forces at play, which will become even more apparent when we look at the third variety. Messy problems often emerge from our different value sets, belief systems, convictions, and ideologies. Let me illustrate this with a disease outbreak. First, we have the hard solutions, tracking supplies with barcodes, delivering antibiotics efficiently. Then come the soft resolutions, mapping how the disease spreads, redesigning indoor spaces to prevent infection. But here's where it gets messy. Pathogens develop antibiotic resistance, or when disease control intersects with the sacred religious practices, as we saw with Ebola outbreaks in recent years. Unlike a hard problem that can be solved, unlike a soft problem that can be resolved, messy situations may only be abstractly dissolved, which means transforming them into a different, possibly manageable state. Think about this challenge. How do we reframe centuries old burial traditions to make them safer during an epidemic while still honoring their deep cultural significance? A hard problem can be optimized. A soft problem can be satisfied. A messy problem needs to be idealized. These problem types aren't separate at all. They're nested within each other. So they need to be solved, resolved, and dissolved. There's hardness within soft problems. There's both hardness and softness within messy problems. And consequently, solutions nest within resolutions, which nest within dissolutions. This dynamic requires us to understand how hard problems become soft, how soft problems become messy, and how all three conspire to create wickedness. Then we humans bring our own complexity to these wicked problems, our bramble of beliefs, our personal biases, our paradoxes, and our prior experiences. And then dangerously, the familiarity trap. We have grown numb to such problems. The term climate change has become so routine, almost comfortable. And in that comfort, we find ourselves evading, even disregarding its daily degradations. What you see is a simple equation to help us think about wickedness. Here, I is the number of states a system could have with n number of elements. Suppose all the components interact with one another in a very basic fashion. Then a two-element system results in 4 states. Add just one more element, you get 64 states. With 10 elements, the number of states will exceed the number of stars in our galaxy. That's why we call this equation the monster. In 1973, scholars Horst Riddle and Melvin Weber cataloged 10 properties of wicked problems. They argued that wicked problems contain no definitive formulation. Each is unique, so no clear start and stop signs. And each problem is a symptom of another problem, so no clear entry and exit points. The so-called solutions aren't true or false, but good or bad. What remains are opportunities to learn by trial and error. If they were works of art, hard problems would be photographs or certain forms of sculpture, offering clarity and directness. And soft problems are like blurry brushstrokes of impressionism. They refuse to stay sharp and defined. Even the truth seems fluid in Van Gogh's hands here. Look at the way the master separates the natural lights from artificial lights. Each reality bleeds into the next. And messy problems are spilled and splattered abstractions. Interpreting this Jackson Pollock is left entirely to the viewer. And because a wicked problem emerges when hard, soft, and messy problems collide, think of them as a cubist collage. where the truth is simultaneously shaky, sharp, and squiggly. Picasso here presents a fragmented nature of visual experience. Of course, it's a pomegranate on a table inside a cafe in Paris. Look at the seeds for the clue here. Concept development is the heartbeat of systems engineering, which is a convening mindset to consider all aspects of a problem. A specialist engineer might flee from contradictions, but a systems engineer embraces them with upfront preparation. Wicked problems require a concept of operations, or in our trade jargon, we call it ConOps, which I've adapted for this book as narratives about a situation we haven't necessarily experienced. In practical terms, ConOps answer three fundamental questions. How would the system work? What functions could it responsibly fulfill? And what outcomes should it achieve? In the book, I describe 6 attributes to inform a concept of operations: efficiency, vagueness, vulnerability, safety, maintenance, and resilience. Each chapter goes through their hard, soft, and messy versions, and how they manifest and what they actually mean in wicked forms. Today, I'm going to feature maintenance, a topic that's obvious and overlooked in our careers and civic life. But first, we need to examine a fundamental choice in engineering and society between innovation and maintenance, between what we prioritize and what we push aside. Consider the contrasts. One is dazzling, the other is dull. One concerns competition, the other relates to care. Now, here's the irony. Maintenance lies at the very heart of engineering responsibility. Yet, innovation gets the spotlight. You see, a sales pitch about a future that doesn't yet exist will always seem more attractive than the mundane maintenance of what we already have. Yet, this obsession over newness, niftiness, and novelty devalues something precious: the tenacity of those who maintain our public infrastructure. Let's examine how the word innovation itself has steadily invaded our lives, our logic, our language. Google's Ngram viewer, which tracks word usage since 1800, shows the spread. See how the word climbs and climbs until it becomes almost inescapable in our modern vocabulary. Watch the pattern repeat with disruptive innovation, like in break things, move fast. What started in the echo chambers of consulting firms, venture capital, and Silicon Valley tech companies has now found its way into middle school classrooms. Same with the word social innovation and design thinking. These trends have led to something different, something that merely masquerades as genuine innovation. We now have relentless innovation speak. Let's be clear, we're all outer beneficiaries of genuine innovation. But innovation speak, that's just sales pitch triumphant over substance. Now, let's talk about the unsung partner of innovation. In fact, the enabler of innovation, one that's less sexy and more vexy. Let's look at how maintenance as a word trends over time. We can see a robust decline in the use of maintenance as a concept and as a sensibility. But if you look deeper, it's actually worse than that. We engineers have fallen into a trap. We have developed this taste for being known, celebrated, and promoted as innovators, as if our entire professional identity needed some glossy rebranding exercise. In reality, a vast fraction of engineers, at least 70% of them, maintain and oversee existing systems. Scholar Claude Claremont wrote in his 1939 book on bridges, the engineer learns most on the scrap heap. The engineer learns most on the scrap heap. We need these metaphorical bridges to remind us. Most practicing engineers don't chase disruptive innovation. Their work prevents disruption. They operate and maintain systems rather than pursuing glory-garnering novelty. Good engineers and good engineering firms understand this truth. Maintenance isn't just life, it is larger than life. Let me take us to the early 1800s, when steam navigation replaced horse-pulled transport. Everything was booming at that time. Cotton trade, molasses trade, whiskey trade, and steamship services multiplied. But the captains became addicted to speed. They would stoke the boilers hotter, shut off safety valves, and turbocharge their ships. Thrilling? Yes. Tragic? Absolutely. In 1838, Congress finally acted. Legislation on safety standards and inspection held ship owners and operators liable for murder, neglect, and malfeasance, with years of hard labor as the punishment. Yet, the measure was weak. In the following decades, as interstate commerce grew, so did the explosions. Between 1807 and 1853, steamer explosions killed over 7,000 people, matching the death toll of hurricanes and floods combined. The chief culprit? Defective or ill-serviced boilers. A failure of maintenance. Then followed the worst disaster in US maritime history. It happened just days after Abraham Lincoln's assassination in 1865. The Sultana, a young steamship, just 2 years old, slipped away from New Orleans in the early darkness of April 27, 1865. The four-storied, 260-foot liner journeyed to St. Louis with 300 people on board. It hauled hens, horses, mules, sugar casks, and coal bins. Then a stop at Vicksburg, Mississippi, a Confederate military post. Nearly 2,000 Union soldiers released from rebel prisons crowded aboard. Sultana was now carrying 5 times her maximum load. 3 boilers blew up a few miles north of Memphis, Tennessee, shredding the sides and blistering the boat. The mishap killed 1,800 lives, surpassing the fatalities of Titanic in 1912. Hundreds more drowned in the Mississippi as Sultana burned. The boat's chief engineer later recalled that inadequate maintenance of boilers led to the explosion. Hard technical fixes can often solve maintenance problems in pressure vessels. New designs, new materials, you name it. So can soft policy statutes, as in creating new proof testing standards, banning competitive racing, setting carriage limits, and so forth. Then the messy matters. What some call government meddling, others recognize as essential protection of public welfare. The Sultana became one of our earliest case studies in how federal government sets safety laws, a legacy that flows through modern regulation to this day. A lesson that's become clear and clearer over time is a simple one. Maintenance is deeply interlocked with safety, even efficiency, also vulnerability, and eventually resilience. Now, with digital monitoring, we can achieve extraordinarily high levels of system availability and reliability. A couple years ago, the German power networks reached a reliability level of 99.9997, with an average outage duration of under 10 minutes. Broadband services have 99.999% availability. That is 5 nines. In some areas, the availability is 9 nines. Private companies, even those proudly marketing themselves as disruptive innovators, spend up to 60% of their operational expenditures, OPEXs, on maintenance. Indeed, maintaining a system over its life cycle may cost more than creating it new, but the result is often a catastrophe avoided. Small maintenance misfortunes can ultimately derail our grandest innovations. Why, after all, build a system if there is no ethic to maintain it well? Maintenance isn't a static process. It builds on change. And just like innovation, it fuels change. Innovators often claim to make history, but maintainers start from history and sustain the critical continuities of history. There can be no useful innovation without a vast, invisible infrastructure of maintenance activity that keeps civilization running. Maintenance is embedded in the origins of public health, a field founded by engineers rather than clinicians. Let me take you to my ancestors in the early Bronze Age. Mohenjo-daro, the Mound of the Dead, is 250 miles north of Karachi in present-day Pakistan, once a flourishing center of the Harappan culture in northwest India. In the early 1920s, when the towns of Mohenjo-daro were excavated, one thing was clear. The Metal Age metropolis from nearly 6,000 years ago exemplified purposeful engineering. Everything was pre-planned. Everything competently managed. The streets ran north and south, east and west, supplied by hundreds of wells. The houses were built with well-burned, standard-sized bricks, as you can see. Their system of weights and measures was consistent. We can learn a lot from my ancestors about their sweeping social vision for sanitation, which many parts of modern India lack millennia later. Sanitation should remind us that maintenance is the most underrated of our civic duty, and that caring for our constructions is as sacred as the act of construction itself. Engineers, much like nurses, are professional care providers. Engineering approaches to wicked problems can only be realized through multiple criteria. The friction between the 6 concepts can mold our solutions, shape our resolutions, and guide our dissolutions. As the Romantic poet William Blake understood, without contraries is no progression. There's no hierarchy among these attributes. Each will produce a revelation and a relationship to the problem, like how good design comes from balance, rhythm, pattern, variety, proportion, and emphasis, and how good composition braids melody, rhythm, texture, timbre, form, and harmony. Roger Martin, the management scholar, compares these contradictions to opposable thumbs. Consider an airline's low-cost strategy, simultaneously balancing customer satisfaction, employee satisfaction, and business profitability, all in creative tension. Each of these 6 elements is crucial, similar to how an aircraft moves with 6 degrees of freedom, the position relative to Earth's horizon. Rotational movements are pitch, roll, and yaw. Translational motions are surge, sway, and heave. These motions together form a synergistic 6. All too often, frustratingly, our cultural and commercial ideals are such that we prefer a single action item to pursue. We have developed an addiction for narrow explanations. Monocausal taxophilia is the love of single causes that explain everything. Yet, true accomplishments, as we know, reside in simultaneously understanding many facets of the problem. Living in Washington, D.C., let me say this. Wicked problems aren't two-sided issues. They are six-sided issues. An acceptable solution, resolution, or dissolution should go through all six filters. We can't mindlessly prioritize one concept over the other. In my book, I look at the past and the possibilities of flight training through the story of the forgotten engineer Edwin A. Link and his Link trainer that he created in 1929. The abominating device flew and felt like an airplane. The Link trainer's initial version featured a hooded cockpit mounted on a turntable, a turn and bank gauge, a compass, and indicators for rate of climb and airspeed. Pilots safely rehearsed at a fraction of actual flying costs without concern for losing life or equipment. The machine's overall setup looked like an 8-foot bumblebee turning in a 15-foot diameter. Inside the dark and cramped chamber, pilots had no outside horizon for reference. This was a precondition to train for instrument flight. The trainer twisted and turned in a geometric ballet, puffing, wheezing, gasping, and groaning. The instructor's desk contained an automatic plotter of the student's course. The two-way radio allowed the student and the supervisor to communicate during the session. Driven by a motor and 3 wheels, the recorder looked like a crab, allowing the students to review and correct their mistakes iteratively. Link's engineering did something revolutionary beyond the machine itself. It put women, many not pilots themselves, at the heart of flight training, creating a path into aviation despite the deep discrimination. The synthetic capabilities enabled by the Link trainer now underpin the entire aviation enterprise. Today, they have democratized access to education, combining psychology, sociology, and technology to produce knowledgeable and skillful crews in many areas. Just consider the collective cost of World War II without flight trainers, the sheer feasibility of the original moonshot, the viability of the modern airline business, and even the commercial and cultural connectivity of our world. Link's Blue Box was as much a skill set trainer as a mindset trainer. It was never a solo solution for a hard problem. It's a model mindset to identify the problem qualities, engage with them on their terms, play the future out, and be open to corrections. You see, we tend to pursue civic decisions as if they are about comparing one option to another. Civics isn't a blind taste test. It's more like a blind flight test. It requires mixing instrumental, sensory, and environmental awareness in our minds. In the parlance of flight training, civics is often in the state of unstable equilibrium, sensitive to disturbances, with stability arising from tugs and pulls. Like engineering, civic competencies to address wicked problems are trainable traits. As the Link trainer showed, training in confinement and training under constraints can offer not only a path to freedom, but show us that it's made of degrees of freedom. Importantly, the Link trainer gave trainees the consciousness of the many angles to approaching a problem. In a way, it's an invitation to think inside the box. Thank you.
Guru, that was great. Many thanks indeed. I think we're about to go to full screen now. Thank you. So, Guru, I want to explore some of the more philosophical things that you brought up in your lecture and in the book. But first of that, I would hate any of our audience to come away with the impression that this is a dry book, largely about philosophy. I think one of the most endearing things about it is the absolute fabulous series of examples that you give. I'm going to just ask you to say perhaps a little bit more about them. And I'll start with Ed Link, because you mentioned him at the end, but it's a leitmotif running throughout the whole book. A fascinating man, brought up in a family producing pianolas. And I had no idea quite how big industry pianolas were at the beginning of the 20th century. And then doing stunt flying, I believe, before getting into producing his trainers. Might you say a little bit more about this man, who I confess I've never heard of before, but he does seem to be a complete hero?
So the book is dedicated to the city of Binghamton, New York. And I took that approach rather than choosing a specific person, because it comes down to, since you alluded to the philosophical notion, what makes a city? I mean, that kind of ties into some of the vague aspects of how we go about formulating our worldviews and so forth. Within Binghamton, which is renowned for its corporations, IBM was founded in the city of Binghamton. And of course, there were numerous technology leaders, such as Ed Link, whom I'll get to in a moment, and how they articulated a vision for business that significantly, substantively, and directly considered local communities' needs. I talked about the Indus Valley during my presentation, but of course, millennia later, there was a Susquehanna Valley that we have completely forgotten about. It was almost leaped into Silicon Valley that is now providing a very different vision for engineering. So between Indus Valley and Silicon Valley, we have many different forms and formulations of engineering as we have come to experience it. One such exemplar turned out to be Ed Link. I was a student of biomedical engineering, and I heard Ed Link's name while I was a student there for 5 years, maybe 2 or 3 times here and there. Definitely not an aviation buff. In fact, when I started this project, I didn't even know the difference between roll and yaw. So I had to teach myself a lot of these aviation concepts. I studied heavily, and I taught myself how to fly a plane on a simulator without crashing and burning, of course, which kind of gets to the core idea of it. About a century ago, just a century ago, aviation was such a nascent business. The Wright brothers were basically instruments in the holy hands of God, and they showed us what's possible through flying a prototype and demonstrating that it can fly longer than the first attempt. But comes to, how do you then train for this unnatural act of flying without losing life or limb? Now, anyone can make, or let me put it this way, manufacturing 10,000 planes is a very different problem. It's a hard problem. But training 10,000 qualified pilots to operate responsibly, reliably, is an altogether different problem that you know very well as an educator. And I think that's where the problem sets are completely divergent. Ed Link was focused on the latter. How do you train pilots when the available aircraft equipment were less? And there was even a famous joke at one point. I think a US president said that, why don't these people take turns in flying an aircraft rather than? So how do you train for war? And how do you basically mass produce pilots was a big problem. And Ed Link couldn't afford flight training himself. And the story, as you alluded to, goes the way of how a piano company was going bankrupt in the city of Binghamton, and I go through the entire history of it. And Ed Link worked for his father, who completely objected to his interest in aviation. And so he was just messing around with some of the pianos and the theater organs, Nickelodeon. So you basically throw in a nickel and it starts playing. And there were some revolutionary advances in the piano technology. Ed Link's dad's company came up with what's called the endless roll technology. It could play 15 tune lengths, and it could come up with different mood-setting music, fighting, pathos, humor, tragedy, and all sorts of things, because that was the form of entertainment back then, just 100 years ago. Very different world. But of course, the onset of talkies and the Great Depression basically relegated that entire industry to footnotes. So the piano company went bust, but Ed Link's inventive instincts clicked into gear here. And that's where I think he picked up some of the tools that he was very familiar with in the piano system, but just replaced the vacuum mechanism to do something else that simulated, that mimicked an aircraft. So it kind of gave them the feel for how it would be. So, and then he goes on to start a company teaching people, featuring the trainer, and there's just no uptake, and it's just bad economy, and he's basically ready to sell his entire business. And then comes a political scandal in the United States, Washington, where there are all these plane crashes happening when they're trying to deliver mail during different weathers. And I think that kind of crystallized the problem here, where pilots weren't really ready or able to do all these things. So then comes Link Trainer into the picture that becomes a kind of the training mechanism. And at one point during the 1930s, so going from rags to riches kind of story here, Ed Link's company is producing one blue box, as it's called, because of the color of the thing, every 45 minutes. And soon it picks up, and there are, I think, about a couple hundred Link Trainer boxes in the world right now. And there are a couple of them in some museums in the UK, and unfortunately not in the National Air and Space Museum here on the National Mall, which we're trying to get it fixed. But then you can see an interesting transition also happens when Ed Link is at the peak of the flight trainer business. And keep in mind, I still haven't used the word flight simulator, which is what most of us relate to. And that's when the computers come into the mix. And I think Ed Link was a fundamentalist in the way of how you go about training, how do you trust not just rely on the instruments, but actually begin to trust them. So, and when the computers start entering the flight training business and become flight simulators, he loses interest because he thinks that that goes beyond the human capacity for training and everything. And he gets very interested in an entirely different medium, underwater archaeology. So he adapts all the flight simulator businesses from the player piano techniques, but for underwater exploration, very different medium. So the question now comes down to, or that relates to how I got fascinated by Ed Link, is how is this one person with no college degree? In fact, some say that he didn't even go to high school, some argue middle school, but just completely crushed the notion of specialization and brought in the systems engineering approaches that had tangible, durable value, life-saving value in the world, is something of a rarity. Too often we pride in being hyper-specialized and we get rewarded. And I think I talked about the innovation agenda that kind of puts us in that track. But Ed Link did it without care or concern for hyper-specialization. Now, that's the kind of consciousness that I thought could serve as an archetype to engage with wicked problems, dealing with deep space to deep sea. He did it. So that's why I got really inspired by his work.
It made a really great story. Now, I'm of an age that when I was at school, we'd be given books to read about Brunel and the famous engineers of the 19th century, which is very much the heroic male engineer. And very much this is a problem, so very much a hard problem. And I confess, Guru, when I first heard your book, I thought, oh no, this is going to be another engineers rule the world book. And it isn't. It's a much more subtle, as we've heard from your talk, examination of the complexities through real world problems. But the question I have for you is that complexity that you have represented in the book and the talk, is that now reflected in the way that we teach our engineers at universities and at other places of education? Are we educating the well-rounded engineers that we need for these complex problems in the modern world?
It reminds me of what the management scholar Russ Ackoff said, who plays a big role in this book, and of course he has influenced my thinking here. He once said something really simple and profound, which is like, the righter we do the wrong thing, the wronger we become. So now the question is, how do you go about choosing or establishing the priorities we set for ourselves at the mandate of society? And I'm speaking as an engineer. How do we correct ourselves in that? We have developed mastery over delivering for hard problems, as I said earlier. Not so much at all. In fact, we are in some way utterly clueless about how to deal with messy problems. And I think that those fields of knowledge are disparate, and I think systems engineers have the capability to bring those threads together. Now, there are three elements, at least when it comes to engineering, which have importance to this conversation. First is, of course, you need the technical depth, and I think that's just utterly basic. So call it basic competencies. But then you also need to develop a set of capabilities to engage with systemic issues. So it's not just about thinking systematically in a context, but also approaching it systemically. And that requires development of capabilities. And whether can you produce systems can you teach systems engineers, or do they get formed only in practice, is a big question within engineering. So how do you foster those capabilities? That's the second point. The third, importantly, is the character associated with problem solving itself, and the problem engagement itself, and the problem formulation. That gets less discussed in engineering. Oftentimes, it's even set aside. It's not thought of, even in some cases, as the core agenda item in engineering design. That's problematic for us, because this is a profession with enormous accountability, enormous consequences, and yet we don't spend too much time to think about this. So there's this parallel going on with the hard, soft, messy problems here. We have the competencies, capabilities, and character, which mirror very well with how one develops engineers or professionals at large who are affected by engineering. So that's my take, Charles. I don't think we are having the right kinds of conversation. And of course, that requires reflection and extended discussions and co-thinking with people who are not engineers, who are affected by engineering.
I mean, I wonder if it's different in different parts of engineering. Certainly, I've seen discussions among civil engineers around flooding, where the lived experience of people within areas that flood, plus expertise from the social sciences, have come together in to me, which seemed a really good way about deciding whether one should have hard solutions or soft solutions to flooding problems, or whether there are areas where you don't try and control the flooding and you do it in different ways.
Yes, you're right. It's a kind of hit or miss, basically. I mean, I tend to think that, I'm invoking the example of Indus Valley again. I mean, this is like a civilization that was built before the number 0 existed. And now that is an advanced form of consciousness where they chose to prioritize sanitation, which India still struggles with right now. Now, so did we just hyper specialize our way out of that, or out of that fundamental consciousness that defines engineering? Now, a lot of people say that, well, systems engineering was readily employed, appreciated, maybe 40, 50 years ago during the Cold War, or before that, the World War. And I think it helped through military work and defense operations research and so forth. But I'm of the view that maybe systems engineering is probably the original instinct of the engineering practice. We have just gotten too specialized beyond recognition to appreciate that fact. Now we are saying that we all need to get better at systems thinking and so forth. So that's how I'm thinking about this, Charles.
So I'm going to go to some of the questions that we've had in, and there have been a couple of questions around maintenance. One pointing out that maintenance is sort of fighting back against the inexorable increase of entropy. But a question saying, how does maintenance, the concept of maintenance, relate to sustainability? Something we talk about a lot these days.
I think it's integral, and I think there are even religious insights from ancient cultures that find this connection. I come from my own background. I and I had an Orthodox Hindu upbringing, and my grandfather was a priest in our village temple and so forth. And some of the acts of um, kind of retrofitting and the repair, so to speak, the periodic rejuvenation of a cultural institution like a temple happened at periodic intervals. We don't have, I don't think governments these days can have that kind of routine scheduled maintenance. If like I know aerospace industry does that, but it's not universal across the practice areas here. We had the concept of the ancient concept of jirnodhara. Jirna means digesting. Udara means advancing. So you digest and advance. So there's this metabolic, biological kind of inspiration to conduct ritualized engineering to maintain public infrastructure. In this case, temples here. So these are ancient notions, maintenance as an instrument for sustainability. So, and I think as the question points out, it's one of those old new concepts that we need to refamiliarize ourselves with. So that's an excellent point.
So a number of questions revolve around how one influences policymakers to do things. And you give a wonderful example in the book, which we don't have time to go into, but of a number of innovative, essentially naval engineers who worked out far better ways for the battleships of the early 2000s to actually hit things. I hadn't realized how rare that was to happen. And so the hard problem was solved very easily, but it was ignored, I think, both in the US and the UK Navy for decades. But perhaps you could take the more general point about how engineers need to interface with policymakers, and especially with your current role at the National Academy of Engineering in Washington, where you are doing that the whole time.
Right, and it kind of goes back to even the origins of the National Academy of Sciences, which is the science advisors to the federal government here. We were founded by Abraham Lincoln during the heart of Civil War, 1863, and some of the first problem sets that the United States federal government gave the national academies were all related to engineering. For example, the problem of when all the wooden ships were being transitioned to iron ships, you had the issues of corrosion, and how do you do studies pertaining to them so that these large complicated systems don't falter or turn out to be faulty. And that, of course, when you try to introduce navigational systems in iron ships, for example, and which are magnetically based, and you know what happens, iron and magnet interfere, and then you get misguided. And that's a kind of the concept that's relevant even in the firing problem, the continuous fire aim problem that you alluded to. So how do you come up with non-magnetic means to navigate a ship? And that led to gyroscopes in the early 1900s and so forth, which over time have influenced what we now take for granted as GPS and satellite-based navigations and so forth. So engineers really go through, I guess, they, as servants of capitalism, are often constrained by what they can actually do. They are still seen as hired guns in some instance. So their job is to just do it. And of course, that is the nature of a modern corporation. The time these corporations give themselves on a quarterly basis and so forth. So we are left with little reflection on the nature of work we do, whether it is improving weaponry or whether we are looking at improving rice yield in some form, farming systems and so forth. So how do we create a more responsible profession is something we need to start with before we go and advise policymakers here. And I think very few engineers are in the realm of public policy. However, they bring in enormous sets of insights and practical value to public policy decision making here. And that's something that I'm personally trying to encourage more of them to get into.
So it's interesting you should say that, because sort of being involved in science policy in this country and looking round, I think we're lucky. I can immediately think of sort of 10 or 15 really senior engineers who are sort of force for good in evidence-based policy making. But can I ask a different question? It's one I have a personal interest as well, as someone who's interested in modeling complex systems. And clearly for some of the hard problems you've talked about, then engineering has a massive number of modeling techniques that give you hard answers out. But then you go to some of the spectrum from messy to wicked problems. And let me give you a wicked problem, which is trying to predict the course of the economy. And we try and have our big economic models, and classically they fail to predict things such as the economic crash in 2008. What is the role of modeling as we move along your spectrum?
The biggest challenge that we have is how do you go about modeling a system at large, a system at scale? And that is, I think, a serious problem to have. And as a student of complex systems, I've come to a realization, and I think this is where I've borrowed heavily from evolutionary biology to get a better instinct into the kinds of systems we ought to be modeling. And I think I want to make a general point here about how we frequently misinterpret and intermix the different meanings of what's popularly called complex adaptive systems. Now, the first, there are at least two distinct meanings here that we confuse ourselves with. The first is a complex system that's adaptive as a whole system, like in a multicellular organism, for example. The second is a complex system with elements that follow their own locally chosen, locally adaptive strategies, as in traffic. So there are a lot of selfish elements there, and everyone wants to get by, cut me over when I drive on the beltway and so forth. But the point here is the second type of a complex system doesn't necessarily organize itself to operate as an integrated whole, like in the first type. And that's why the second type could lead to many maladaptations that are witnessed in financial vulnerabilities, national security vulnerabilities, even electoral integrity and the trust associated with it and so forth. And that's why a key reason why these two types of systems aren't distinguished well enough is both are interdependent and both can give off unpredictable properties, emergent behavior. And that's why we don't have good bearing on what's we might call complex maladaptive systems over complex adaptive systems. So the biggest modeling challenge pertains to how we get good at understanding maladaptations. So that creates a big design problem, or the modeling problem for us. How do you convert the second type of complex adaptive systems into the first type, which is the desired thing? And I think that is the engineering design problem for us in this century.
And one of the things that you said in the book, which I so much agree with, that when one is using models of different types, then to try and have multiple different types of models. And you quote the population biologist Richard Levins, that truth is the intersection of lies, where each model is a lie.
Truth is the intersection of independent lies. That's what he
Independent. That's very important. And again, I think one of the really interesting things about the COVID epidemic that we've just been through and using modeling there is the degree of independence of the different models that we've been using.
You're absolutely right. And I think that goes back to some of the things that we have thought about for a while, encouraging pluralism in modelings, different types of them. And I specifically talk about how engineers rebuilt basically the protective barriers after Hurricane Katrina in New Orleans back in 2005. And you come up with very different, you got simulation models, you got mathematical models, and you got brute force physical models, each of them having their own set of results. Each of them are lies in their own way, but the current design of the Katrina, the post-Katrina levee system is based on the intersection of these independent models. Each of them lies.
I thought that was a great example, which I shall shamelessly steal for my own teaching. We're coming to the end, but I want you just to mention the single most astounding example you gave in your book, and partly because I'd never heard of it before, and partly there's a natural human tendency to look at disasters and think, good Lord. Could you say a little about the Boston molasses incident, which I mean, it was a tragedy for the people involved, but it's an extraordinary story.
It's a peculiar plight. So it's famously called the molasses flood, and it pertains to a company, Purity Distilling Company, that back in the 1915 erected a big tank, which was the largest in New England, to basically to be a container for molasses that was being shipped from the Caribbean. And the goal was the different phases of molasses production. At one particular point, you used molasses to produce ammunitions. This was the time that the United States was entering World War I, and you needed rapid supplies of munition. And so this was a container tank, and it was built hastily. And someone gave it a certification saying that it was sturdy and safe and sound to use. And of course, the private corporations, with their usual cost-cutting strategies, cost-saving strategy in this case, they just wanted to get ahead, and they did it. And the people who worked for the company started having panic attacks. And I specifically talked about this guy who couldn't sleep for months, and he started running toward the tank because he had nightmares saying that the tank was just falling apart. And all the molasses was covering the entire city of Boston, which is exactly what happened, because the tank was underrated for safety factor. And it was, of course, the design margins were ill thought of, and about 20 plus people died, many animals died, and so forth. And that
and I think if I remember right, you talked about a 30-foot wall of molasses going down the street
at that 35 miles per hour. So it was basically covering everyone, appending everything. So it was pretty bad. And that kind of, people relate to these catastrophes in a significant way. There's something about human mind. We just gravitate toward failure modes. And again, that's one of the things that I'm a student of, failure analysis. In fact, I took 6 months of failure analysis before I was even allowed to touch more sensitive instruments and so forth. So this is something that engineers are particularly cautious about, and we don't want to repeat these failures. So of course, from different engineering aspects, you can think about how do you build better containers. And I talked about the pressure vessels in this example. So there's some overlap there, at least.
And it did lead to some good.
The boiler
it did lead to some good, some revision of the regulations and things.
Correct, and I think that's exactly what happened. And then even for a hard failure like the molasses tank, people couldn't agree on what the failure mode was. Harvard professors and MIT professors was fighting against one another, and so it's unfortunately a colorful illustration of how things happen. This has all happened this past century. We don't even my examples are all primarily from this past century we have completely forgotten about. And even the hero of this book, Ed Link, is a forgotten engineer. So I've just tried to just look a little bit back to see what could we learn with the potentially objective viewpoint, rare view.
Guru, forgive me, I'm going to have to break in there because we do finish promptly on the hour. Can I thank the audience for attending and also for some really interesting questions? Do look at our website for talks we have coming up this year. I think you'll see on your screen that we have one on how innovation in the private sector can help address major 21st century challenges by Warren Easton. Warren has led both Rolls-Royce and ARM, the company ARM. So please join us for that. It just leaves me to thank Guru for a fascinating talk around a fascinating book. And there are so many lessons for not only engineers, but those of us in other cognate disciplines. And it's just delightful to see some heroes of the past brought back to life in such an engaging way. So please appreciate, I'm afraid it's a virtual round of applause from people in the audience at the moment. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Charles, and thank you, everyone.